There we go. So good morning to everybody. I see that we have reached the hour of 9 a.m. on this beautiful Sunday morning. At least it's beautiful here in Memphis, Tennessee. The sun is out. It is a little bit warm, but it is July after all, so it should be warm. And just heard that the person who's having audio problems has figured it all out, so that's great news. I want to begin first just with a quick introduction for those of you who weren't here last week. My name is Dr. Peter Gathjer. I'm the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean at Memphis Theological Seminary. Welcome to Sunday Morning Seminary that is presented by Memphis Theological Seminary with the help of generous donors. So if you'd like to be a generous donor, you can also go to the Sunday Morning Seminary webpage and help continue this work. Next week, Dr. Christopher Davis will be the presenter. He's the Associate Dean of Doctoral Studies and Pastoral Ministry at Memphis Theological Seminary. He's also the longtime pastor of St. Paul Baptist Church here in Memphis. And he's going to take all of us to the next step in terms of a spirituality in a time of pandemic. He is going to specifically focus for 2 weeks on worship in a time of pandemic. And Dr. Davis brings years of experience and study to the practice of worship. We might be considering what does it mean to worship in these times, and how do we worship? One of the most disruptive things for us in Christian churches at this time has been the lack and loss of communal worship, of being in the same place with each other at the same time and not simply virtually. So he is going to address those issues and related issues next week and the week after. And then I'll remind you that in August, Dr. Michael Turner, who's a professor of church history here at the seminary, will be, for 4 weeks, focusing on religion during the time of the Civil War, which I think is going to be a fascinating exploration of those people of faith at the time of the Civil War, how they continued to practice their faith, how they saw the meaning of the Civil War. And you might be thinking, what does that have to do with the time in which we live? Well, think a little bit about that and see how we live also in a time of great cultural strife and conflict, deep division in our society, and how do we address that as people of faith? So that's coming up in the month of August. But today we're returning to a spirituality in a time of pandemic. Last week, we talked about the 2 practices of grieving and of gratitude. And this week, we're going to focus on 2 additional practices, namely graciousness and going forth. And I'm going to connect those new practices to our old practices of last week. The practice of being gracious grows out of acknowledging our grief and the grief of others, and out of gratitude for the goodness that continues in our lives, even in the midst of suffering and grief. Now, this past week, I hope you were practicing both grieving and gratitude to enter into this spirituality of pandemic. And I have to say that part of that practice of grieving is attending to and listening to the grieving that is going on around us. And it's important as we continue with these next 2 steps of graciousness and going forth that we don't suddenly jump out of and leave behind those other practices that we already talked about. So I just a little smattering of what I heard last week related to grieving. Somebody posted on Facebook, and Facebook is problematic in a lot of ways, but it helps me to keep a pulse, sort of keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on in the broader society. And someone posted this question on Facebook Is anybody else just so damn tired? I thought that was an amazing question. Soul damned tired. And over 30 people chimed in response. Every single one of them said yes. People said things like yes, and no amount of sleep takes care of it. Yes, most days it feels like I'm walking through quicksand. Then later in the week, somebody posted, I'm fearful for everyone's mental health and sanity are being tested these days by 1, the pandemic, 2, the cultural wars, and 3, the senseless violence in our society and the lack of any coherent solutions being offered to address inequality and discrimination. Then he closed by saying, other than this dismal perspective, try and be optimistic and have a good day. Finally, a friend wrote that he now truly understands the meaning of the word Weltschmerz. And I had to go to my dictionary and look up Weltschmerz. And it's defined as a mood of weariness or sadness about life arising from the acute awareness of evil and suffering. Weltschmerz. So I just want to do a little check-in with everybody out there in our virtual classroom. How are you doing? Did you feel and hear and practice grief this past week? Has that been a helpful spiritual practice? I hope so, just to acknowledge what's going on. You can just raise your hand with the little item there at the bottom of your bar, or maybe throw into the chat box. What did you hear? What did you see this week still in terms of grief? As we're doing that, I'm just going to keep saying again that this grieving is not just, just grieving. We're trying to do this as a spiritual practice. We're trying to listen in the midst of that grieving for something of God. Are we being called in the midst of this grieving to act with compassion? Remember last week we talked about Jesus' example. Somebody said, please spell that word Weltschmerz. Let me go back to my notes here. It's spelled this way: W-E-L-T-S-C-H-M-E-R-Z. Weltschmerz. Boy, that mood of weariness. And what we tried to do last week was talk about how Jesus practiced grieving in his life and his ministry. And for him, that the grieving was always connected to compassion. And that's what we are being called to try to do in this practice of grieving. It might be helpful to think here of an old tradition within Christian spirituality that goes back to St. John of the Cross. If you don't know St. John of the Cross, look him up. He's one of the great spiritual teachers in our Christian tradition. He and other saints, I'm reading from a woman now, Linda Dowdy, a book called Rhythms of Growth, 365 Meditations to Nurture the Soul. Linda Dowdy, D-O-U-T-Y, wrote this: saints have spoken of the dark night of the soul as a container of holy transformation, a process that's much broader and richer than a bout with sad feelings. Just as the darkness of the cocoon serves to incubate the growth of the butterfly, so we can use the tough times as rich soil for the growing of our souls. Though we may have to gulp hard to express gratitude for such painful periods, through grace we can be grateful in them, trusting that the holy dark serves as a cocoon rather than as a coffin. So this is a really helpful way, I think, as we're thinking of this practice of grieving still. Think of this as part of this tradition of the dark night of the soul. Whereas I came across from one of my African-American friends, when you moan, the devil don't know what you talking about. That was from his grandma. Just as powerful as that longer quote, when you moan, the devil don't know what you're talking about. Putting our moaning into the very presence of God. So we also talked about gratitude last week, that spiritual practice of gratitude, that as we grieve, we also need to attend to the gifts of God that remain in our lives. That as we pray, we can go with Paul's words in Romans chapter 8, 26 to 27. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit intercedes for us through wordless groans. And God, who searches our hearts, knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. So as we remember our gifts, as we attend to the gifts in our lives, we are remembering that God is faithful, that God continues to gift us, even in the midst of our suffering. We go back to that great verse in the book of Lamentations, Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 to 24. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. God's mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in God. Great is thy faithfulness. So with that quick review, let's turn to the two practices that we're going to consider today, namely graciousness and going forth. So graciousness, if we turn back into the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament, we try to come up with a biblical definition of graciousness. All the words that get translated in our Bible and from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, that get translated as gracious or graciousness, they're all derived from the same Hebrew root word, which is kanun. Kanun, the Hebrew word that gets translated gracious. Well, what's the richness of the meaning of that word? Sometimes it gets paralleled with healing or helping or raising up or refuge or strength or to give strength. But as I was studying this word, somebody said that if we could really sum up its meaning, it means to provide protection. And where would a nomadic Hebrew run for protection? This person said, to the camp, which in the Hebrew language is the word mahanan, which is a noun related to kanun. We may think here also of a child running to the protection of a parent, that gentle and protective embrace. I'm delighted to have in my life a 4-year-old daughter, and when she stubs her toe or bumps her knee, she comes running to the nearest available parent, either me or my wife, and just to hold her and to comfort her, her tears start to go away. That's the meaning of this word gracious, this embrace. So we might ask ourselves then, how do we practice graciousness? I'm going to lift up 3 aspects of the practice of graciousness. The first is that we acknowledge that God's graciousness is present in our lives. So there'll be an acknowledgement of God's graciousness. That's our first practice in the practice of graciousness. We accept God's graciousness by becoming gracious to ourselves. And then third, we extend God's graciousness known and accepted in our lives as we are gracious to others. So I'm going to go through each one of those aspects of this practice of graciousness. So we're going to start with acknowledging God's graciousness. Now, you might think, oh, well, didn't we talk about this last week when we were talking about gratitude? And yes, gratitude is definitely related to graciousness, but gratitude was focused really on attending to and acknowledging specific gifts from God that remain in our lives, that we recognize in our lives. But graciousness is more than that simple thankfulness, though it's clearly related to it. It's not just about thankfulness for specific gifts, but go back to that root meaning of this word. It's to allow ourselves to enter into and to accept the protective embrace of God. Graciousness is resting in God's loving presence. Not just individual gifts, but to say, how do we rest in God's gracious presence? Well, one way that I find helpful for resting in God's gracious presence, and I'll just throw it out there and suggest it for your consideration, is to meditate upon biblical passages that point to God's graciousness. There's an old spiritual practice that some of you are probably familiar with. It's called Alexio Divina, the meditative mulling over of a scriptural passage. Highly recommend, if you have not done Alexio Divina, to look into that practice. And what I'm suggesting here is a kind of Alexio Divina over passages like this. Say Psalm 145, verse 8. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and great in loving kindness. Or Exodus 34, chapter 34, verse 6. Then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. Or this old blessing from Numbers chapter 6, verse 25. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. So we are, as we meditate on these kinds of passages, we can allow ourselves to relax, to let go into the graciousness of God. Now, we accept God's graciousness by becoming gracious to ourselves, and this is the next step that we're going to kind of weave into that awareness of the graciousness of God, that we rest in God's love by being loving towards ourselves. So how are these two connected? How is God's graciousness and graciousness to ourselves, how are they intertwined? How do we rest in God's love and thereby become loving toward ourselves? And don't worry, we will get to loving others, but we're trying at this point simply to rest in the graciousness of God, to feel in our lives the graciousness of God. So I'm going to talk about two things here in relationship to how we let this graciousness seep into our lives so that we can be loving to ourselves. And the first goes back to the days of when I was a professor and coach at Kalamazoo College in Kalamazoo, Michigan, back in the early 90s. And Kalamazoo College had this wonderful tradition each spring that was called the Day of Gracious Living. I did a little research this week as I was curious about it. It started back in 1974 when the Kalamazoo College declared a Day of Gracious Living, canceling all classes for the day so that students could engage in a day of fun. Now, I taught there from 92 to 96, and each spring, after that long Michigan winter, the Day of Gracious Living would be proclaimed, a free day. And even this day, I'm sure, got its start out of a quote that was inscribed actually in stone at the front of one of the dormitories on the campus. And the slogan was, "The end of learning is gracious living." As I'd walk from my campus housing to class each day, I'd always go by that dorm and I would be reminded, the end of learning is gracious living. The purpose of learning in our lives is so that we can conduct our lives graciously. I'd loved that. I still love it. Obviously, I'm still talking about it some 20 years later. But the importance of leisure, of relaxing, especially important, no doubt, to driven students at a fairly elite private college, but it's also important to all of us. And I realized after a while that the school had roots in the American Baptist Church, that this very slogan that the end of learning is gracious living, and this day of gracious living really probably harked back to those Baptist roots and an ancient spiritual discipline that I'm going to now focus in on, namely Sabbath. Here we are on a Sunday, which can often be our Sabbath, but it might be that we need to find another day for Sabbath. What Sabbath says is that the end of learning is not just gracious living, but the very end of life, the very purpose of life is gracious living. Sabbath is our day of gracious living. It's our day of resting in God's love. If we think of this in this time of pandemic and social upheaval, social unrest, it really is taking the time to have a break, to give ourselves a break, to give others a break, to not expect too much of ourselves, of being gentle with ourselves as we struggle in these times, of embracing the quiet and the rest and the time apart. Now, there's a connection, of course, here with the crucial story in the Hebrew Scripture in the Old Testament, the story of Sabbath as we get it in the Exodus story. You might recall that when Moses goes to Pharaoh, Moses makes a demand of Pharaoh. And right now, maybe in your heads, the song, "Let My People Go," is starting to resound between the ears. Go down, Moses. And what does Moses say to Pharaoh? Let my people go. In fact, he says it 7 times in the book of Exodus. Exodus 5, Exodus 7, Exodus 8, twice in Exodus 8, and then twice in Exodus 9, and once again in Exodus 10. Moses says again and again to Pharaoh, let my people go. But to do what? To what purpose? The full quote that we don't get in the song is, let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me, that is to God, in the wilderness. Let my people go to worship. Get this connection to next week's presentation, worship in a time of pandemic. But as we think about this now, let my people go so that they may worship God in the wilderness. Just what is Sabbath? Sabbath is a practice that frees us from slavery. I'm going to say that again. Sabbath is a practice that frees us from slavery. Now, what is slavery? Well, slavery can take a variety of forms, but basic to slavery is that we labor, and when we rest is not up to us. Somebody else is determining when we labor and when we rest. And there's no rest in real slavery, in the harshest of slavery. And slavery is harsh, and it's hard. And it is important to break out of slavery through the practice of Sabbath in which we experience the graciousness, the freedom, the liberation of being in God. Now, this isn't easy. A life of graciousness, ironically or paradoxically, is a discipline. It's a practice. We have to attend to it. Think of the Israelites again, that once they got out of Egypt, it took them 40 years to get the Egypt out of them. 40 years to get the Egypt out of them. 40 years in the desert, having to learn how to rest in God's graciousness. Now, I don't know about you, but we're not 40 years into this pandemic, and God willing, we will not have 40 years of pandemic. 4 months or so seems like 40 years. This is a time of struggle. And part of our struggle, not the entirety of it, but part of our struggle is learning how to let go of our being enslaved to Egypt. To let go of the idols that we have built and that we have worshiped. Things like the Israelites had to let go of. They had to let go of idols. They had to let go of hoarding things. Remember the manna story. They had to let go of complaining. There's a difference between grieving and complaining. Complaining is just that. It's like, I'm just emoting about how horrible things are for me. Grieving, of course, as we talked about last week, is leading us into compassionate solidarity with others. So where are we in this Exodus story? This is always, as we study biblical passages, we can always ask the question, who do I identify with in the Exodus story? And for many years, of course, and even to this point, I'd like to identify either with Moses or with the Israelites. They're kind of the heroes of the story in many ways. But I was reading a book a few years back that suggested to me that my own position might be more of being Pharaoh. Think of how we are often Pharaoh to ourselves and to others, but we're just going to focus on ourselves at this point. That we can be demanding taskmasters of our own selves, unforgiving. Get back to making those bricks. Oh, you want a break? Well, now I'm going to make it even harder for you to make those bricks. We're too often probably, I know I am to myself, too often Pharaoh to myself. I am a slave master to myself. And this is what this practice of graciousness is saying. Let go of that inner Pharaoh. Let that Pharaoh go so that we may enter into that gracious living with God. You know, give ourselves a day off. One of the ways I need to try and do this is to get off of Facebook, get off of all social media, get away from the television for a day, or if I can't do a day, for 8 hours, a day where I just don't attend to the things that are distracting me from God's graciousness. And I might think of this here, we might try to think of this as the pandemic shutdown, as we may be heading back into one, is not simply a restriction, but it's an opportunity for freedom. And that is a way of reversing the expectations of the world. So here we are, we think of, for thinking of the purpose of Christian discipleship, we may think of the end or the purpose of Christian discipleship is to practice life in a gracious manner. Unless we're going to jump out of the Hebrew scriptures here as we're thinking about Sabbath into the life and teaching of Jesus. And you know, there's a lot of stories in the Gospels about Jesus and the Sabbath. And this is because the Sabbath was such a crucial practice in the lives of the Jewish people, just as it's a crucial practice in our lives of trying to have a Sunday in which we worship. Of course, Sabbath wasn't a Sunday for the Israelites. But think of Sabbath here in just one story. I'm going to go to the gospel that many of you studied with Dr. Miner back in June, the Gospel of Mark. If we go to Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, is this incredible story, amazing story of the man with the withered hand, who has come to Jesus and asked that his hand would be healed. And note that if you have a withered hand, you would not be able to work, but you're also considered under the Hebraic law as being unworthy even perhaps to enter the temple. So this is pretty crucial stuff, this man with a withered hand. And Jesus asked the religious leaders who are gathered around, who are waiting to see what Jesus is going to do here, because it's the Sabbath day. No work is supposed to be done on the Sabbath day. And Jesus asked those religious leaders, what's the purpose of Sabbath? What's the end of Sabbath? Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill? That's the question that Jesus asked of these religious leaders. Do you remember their response? They were silent. They wouldn't answer the question. If there's anything a teacher doesn't like, is a silent classroom. And why were they silent? Because they knew that their answer was not quite right. And yet they were being compelled by their own sense of authority to give a bad answer. So what was Jesus' response to this silent classroom? Jesus looked around at them with anger, and he was grieved at their hardness of heart. So then he heals the man. Why? Because for Jesus, like for the God of Israel, the purpose of Sabbath is a gracious purpose. It's a gracious purpose, this Sabbath, for freedom, for liberation, not heavy, oppressive requirements, not enslavement. But the end of Sabbath is gracious living. The end of Christian discipleship is gracious living. Our resting in the presence of God is to free us to be gracious with ourselves and with others, to be gentle, to be healers, not harmers. So in this time of pandemic, are we taking time to rest in God's love? Are we taking the time to be healed? Now, I'm going to break the silent classroom just a little bit here and pause, rest a minute, and ask you a question that you can respond to in the chat feature. How are you going to practice this graciousness? That is, how are you already perhaps resting in God's love? How might you be gracious to yourself? How might you say to your inner Pharaoh, let me go, to be gentle? So you might just share that on the chat for a minute. How will you seek to practice this graciousness to yourself at this point? I'm not asking about graciousness to others. We're going to start with ourselves. Good. Somebody said, stop so much multitasking. Boy, that's a big practice. Do some sacred breathing, some intentional breaths each day. Breathe in the love of God and breathe out that anxiousness. Meet with a prayer group online that practices Alexio Divina. Yay. That's a good practice and can be very helpful. Resting in God's graciousness. Letting God's love come to us. I was about to make breakfast and listen, but I needed to sit down and listen to you. Well, don't forget your breakfast, because that's part of being gracious to oneself as well. Spending time today by attending and participating in online services. One of the things I've really enjoyed during this time of pandemic is moving into a variety of services. It's one of the advantages of being the dean of a seminary, is that I have all sorts of alumni who are doing such great work with online services, and I dive in and spend 15 or 20 minutes with one service, and then I go to another, and it's just the richness of the worship that's going on is compelling. So think this week and beyond. This is our practice of being silent, do morning meditation, listen to nature, practice soul care, including breath prayers and practicing silence. These are all ways, and again, this practice of resting in God's graciousness is a huge part of the tradition of Christian spirituality, and they're just rich resources in our history as churches for these ways that we can take care of our souls, that we can let go and let God be gracious in our lives. So we're going to turn now to this next step. It was the third step in graciousness, but it's really leading right into this practice of going forth. But remember, each of these are not like steps that you do one, then you do the next one, then you do the next one, but they're practices that we keep coming back to. So be careful about not leaving this step of God's graciousness too quickly, or ignoring it by just going forward to the next one. Or grieving or gratitude. They all work together in our lives. I'm going to quote, as we make this transition to going forth, I'm going to quote from a predecessor of mine in the office of the dean, not my immediate predecessor, who was Dr. Stan Wood, but his immediate predecessor, who was Dr. Barbara Holmes. And Barbara Holmes is a great theologian and contemplative. And she was talking in this passage about the practice that she's focusing on. She says, the practice I'm focusing on is self-love and love of neighbor. We tend not to be very good at either one, but during this time of isolation, of this time of pandemic, we have equal opportunities to rest and to heal, to love and to be loved. So that points us to these practices of gratitude and to graciousness. But then she takes us to our next spiritual practice of going forth. She says, for me, a spiritual practice that matters includes social renewal. Instead of blaming others about the state of our union, instead of blaming one political party or another, we actually can reflect on our own complicity and support of systems that abandon the poor, warehoused our children in failing schools, and failed to provide adequate health care even under normal circumstances. And of course, we could go on. As a spiritual practice, Barbara Holmes writes, we can wake up to the possibility of building a new order. We can improvise those possibilities, try them out in the creative microcosm of a shared public life. And we're not talking about the state here, we're talking about our own communities, our churches, our neighborhoods. Realizing that our way of life before the pandemic was not perfect, it could be improved so that all members of our society thrive. So this is taking us to this fourth practice of a spirituality in a time of pandemic, which is linked into the third step of the practice of graciousness, in case you're trying to follow my convoluted outline. This is where we extend God's graciousness, known and accepted in our own lives, to our being gracious with others. We go forth. Now, please, do not attempt this step without continuing to practice the other steps, right? Keep the other steps going. We have a tendency, I certainly have a tendency, to want to go forth too quickly without breathing, without Alexio Divina, without resting in the graciousness of God, or even without taking time to acknowledge my own hurts and my own grieving and the grieving of others. I want to get things done. That good old American know-how. And that's good. We're going to go forth. But as we go forth, we will only go forth well if we remain grounded in those other practices. There's a passage from the letter of 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9, 2 Timothy 1:9, that is helpful for me here. God has saved us and called us to a holy life, a gracious life, not because of anything we have done, but because of God's own purpose and grace. This grace was given us in Christ Jesus from the beginning of time. What a great passage to remind that all that we do is grounded in the graciousness of God. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. So the way I'm going to talk about going forth is I'm going to talk about it in relationship to each of those previous practices. So we're going to go forth to grieve with others, to support others in their grief, to be in solidarity with others in our grief as human beings, and to help others to process their grief because we too are in grief and we have attended to grief. One of the things, again, that one of my little practices on Facebook is there are so many requests for prayer that come through, and people are grieving. A friend of mine who just lost one of his parents, a nephew of mine who just lost a friend of his to suicide, people who are experiencing the serious symptoms of COVID-19. There's always something that people are asking for prayer. And I do is take a moment and pray. That's attending to the grief of others and recognizing our own grief. We can be what Henry Nouwen, who's a great spiritual writer, has written. We can be wounded healers. When we try to enter into this dislocated world, we remember the wounds that are in our own hearts. That's going to help us to practice compassion. I often talk about at Manna House, this place of hospitality that I help to run for people on the streets, that our main ministry there is a ministry of presence. We don't have all the answers. We're not even trying to offer all the answers. It's a ministry of listening, of acknowledging the suffering and the grief that are in other people's lives. So we're not offering solutions. We're simply accompanying people on their journey. So we're going forth to grieve with others. We're also going to go forth to celebrate with others, to share in worship and in festival the gifts that are in our lives. We're going to find ways to be alive that are not about consumption, but that are about simply celebration. I got to experience this yesterday because it was my birthday. And early in the morning, not too early, but early in the morning, a friend of mine who happens to be a graduate of Memphis Theological Seminary and happens to be a Grammy Award-winning saxophonist, Kirk Whalum, he sent one of those musical messages to me, a text message. He didn't play the saxophone. He sang, and he did it in a particularly horrible way because he was imitating what I do at Manna House when we have the birthday of a guest. We try to sing as loudly and as off-key as we can. And that's what he was doing to celebrate my birthday, and I appreciated it greatly. And that's part of how we acknowledge gifts. We keep our sense of humor. And humor is related to humility. We don't take ourselves too seriously as we celebrate with others. We enjoy each other's foibles instead of just simply getting frustrated with them. We might even think of some of those foibles, strangely enough, as gifts. So we go forth to celebrate and find ways to celebrate. I mean, and Sabbath is a time of celebration, to celebrate the goodness of God that is in our lives. And we go forth to be gracious with others. You know, there's this great quote from a person, I don't really know who this is, W. Clement Stone, who said, "If you are really thankful, what do? You share." That's what we do when we're grateful. So we can reflect together on how we go forth in graciousness with others. And we do that, again, by being grounded still in the graciousness of God. Think of God's graciousness in important passages. They're in your handout about God not in the whirlwind, but in the still small voice, the small still voice. 1 Kings chapter 19, 11 to 13. Great story of God not in the earthquake, not in the noise and the confusion, but God in this small still voice. Or Isaiah chapter 42, 2 to 4. The suffering servant, which gets applied to our Christian belief of Jesus. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not extinguish. God goes forth in our lives with us in a way in which we are then able to overcome evil with good, with graciousness. It's a great line from Romans chapter 12, verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. As Jesus said, don't do an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but resist in ways that overturn the apple cart of a cycle of evil, of retribution. That's how God acted in Jesus Christ. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. 2 Corinthians 8:9. So this is our practice of going forth. What we do in going forth is we breathe with each other. We become co-conspirators in the Holy Spirit. We breathe together. I'm going to quote from Julie Poulter, reviving our common life in a world struggling to breathe. We breathe together in ways seen and unseen. And though that makes us vulnerable, it also gives us common life. Without our God-given life spirit, our holy breath filling both our lungs and our souls. So without that God-given life spirit, that holy breath filling both our lungs and souls, we are but dry bones. So this final practice is that we are going forth. We're going forth even though we don't know, excuse me, when this pandemic is going to end. Nobody really knows. But we're going to go forth to be faithful and not worry so much about whether or not we're effective. Let's put it in God's hands. So we're going to go forth with love, with these practices of grieving, of gratitude, of graciousness. Informed by grief, we will be compassionate. Informed by gratitude, we'll be thankful. Informed by graciousness, we'll be gentle and loving. And in all of these, we're going to try to be to others what we have received from God. That is, we're practicing a fullness of life in resistance to the powers of death. We're practicing a fullness of life in which we affirm, we welcome each person as Jesus has welcomed us. We share the goods of God's creation in ways that everyone will have enough because we're sharing. We're not going to hoard the manna. We're going to share fullness of life by being richly loving and just in our relationships with each other, in our churches, in our families, in our communities, in our world. As I was moving around this week and I was thinking about sort of how to end this presentation, a hymn came to my mind. And I'm going to spare you me singing this hymn, but I'd urge you maybe to go to YouTube and Google and YouTube it up, do a YouTube search of Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. What a great song that I think kind of sums up these practices that we've been thinking through together and reflecting on together. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me in thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. Open now the crystal fountain, whence the healing stream doth flow. Let the fire and cloudy pillar, see the Exodus reflection there, lead me all my journey through. Strong deliverer, be thou still my strength and shield. Lord, I trust thy mighty power. Wondrous are thy works of old. Thou deliverest thine from thraldom, since being set free, who for naught themselves had sold. Thou didst conquer, sin and Satan and the grave, the liberation that comes to us in God. When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. Death of deaths and hell's destruction, land me safe on Canaan's side. Songs of praises, I will ever give to thee. Graciousness, resting in God's graciousness. Musing on my habitation, musing on my heavenly home, fills my soul with holy longings. Come, my Jesus, quickly come. Vanity is all I see. Lord, I long to be with thee. What a great song, what a great hymn, and how we may end. I end my part of this presentation. We have a few minutes for questions or comments if you have some, and I remind you, as you might be thinking of a question or comment, that next week at 9 a.m., Dr. Chris Davis will be coming to you in his powerful style, his insightful wisdom on worship in a time of pandemic. So that's why I want to end with a hymn, so that sort of sets the stage for a time of worship. Might be your opening hymn. Somebody said, "Oh wow, I had not heard that song in forever." Yeah, aren't the old hymns great? I love the old hymns. One of the things I discovered too is that there's kind of a white version of this hymn, and there's an African American version of this hymn, and they're both amazing and powerful in different ways. It's part of the power that's in us, I think, power that's in us as a united church in Christ. Other comments or questions as we draw near to an end? I'll also remind you that each of these presentations is recorded and is put up on the Sunday Morning Seminary page of the Memphis Theological Seminary website, www.memphisseminary.edu. Easy to find, and the Sunday Morning Seminary is up in the tab, the right-hand tab on the home page of Memphis Theological Seminary. So, well, I think we're then near our end. I'm not seeing questions, so I'm not going to hold you long. Some of you I know are going off to real church. Some are going off to real virtual church. I thank you for your participation. Encourage you to continue to practice grieving, gratitude, graciousness, and going forth, and to see how those are intertwined with each other, that there are practices that will feed each other as you go. And I thank you again, everyone, and bid you a blessed Sunday, and hope and pray for each of you as we continue together in this journey of Christian discipleship that has as its end gracious living. So, goodbye.